This video is about creating and using groups, which you see on the left-hand side of the screen right now under the Model Explorer. Now, when you begin a project, you have this groups icon, but the inside is completely empty because you have to create your own groups. And the reason why we have groups is because while we have very strong and very powerful filtering options in Comosys, the filtering options in certain specific cases which do not really lend themselves to filtering techniques. Because if you remember, if I were to, for example, double click over here and go to the filter section, you will see over here that we have a general tab and object types tab and groups tab, and basically all the objects which we have in Comosys, they can, so for the profile types, we have all sorts of filters we can do. For plates, we have all sorts of, but these are all, if you notice, they're basically the field-based filters, if you will. So if you want to filter out the columns or the beams or the I-type profiles or a particular material or a particular ID, or if I were to go object types, you might want to only show the grids and the profiles, so you can filter by object types. But no matter what you do, these are not arbitrary filters. They are based on fields. And if you have a really horrible mixture of fields, then it might become impossible to use the filters. So for instance, if I wanted to filter out, say, an arbitrary selection, so if I wanted to filter out these elements from this view. Now, these elements don't really fit any filter in the sense that if I were to filter out columns, then all the columns would go. If I were to filter out this particular profile, then maybe this particular profile is repeating itself somewhere over here, and I don't want to filter that one out. Similarly, if I wanted to filter out certain plates and I used a plate thickness filter or something like that, then maybe the same plate occurs over here also, and I don't. So if I needed to do something as arbitrary as this, then my normal filters would not work. And for those, I would need something special, which we call group filters. So how do we create a group? So it's very simple. What you do is you come to this group icon over here, or a menu item over here, and you right click and you say create group. And the moment you do that, it asks for a group name. So let's call this G1 and say OK. And when you do that, a group by the name of G1 is created under the group section. And by the way, what you can do is you can create groups within groups. So I can select G1 and say create group, and it can say G1-1, for example. So I can create a directory type structure under the G1 group, and I can create another one under this one, and so on and so forth. And that's very, very simple. Now, once we have created these groups, how do we use them? So the idea is to actually put certain selected members inside these groups. As you can notice on the screen already, there are some existing groups in this model. And what the numbers you see over here basically tell you how many elements have been added to this group. And the first number, I think, is the total, is the number of elements added, and the second number, I think, includes all the subgroups as well, so or vice versa. Let's just check that as we go. So it's very simple how you add elements to the group. What you do is you basically make a random selection. You can make a random selection like this as well. You can pick different parts of the building, but let's just pick this part of the building over here. And once you're done with the selection, you basically press this button over here, which basically allows you to drag those elements into the group. And when you press this button, then if you hover over G1 and click, immediately you see that it is filled up with 172 elements. And these are the elements which we had selected, and which you can also see are mentioned in your selection information as well. Now, these objects which you select can be anything. They can be points, they can be lines, they can be profiles, they can be bolts, plates, generic solids, rebars. Basically, any object of Comosys can be put into these groups. Now to show you some of the features of the group, let's create another group over here. Let's call this G2. And once I've created G2, what I can do is I can select another part of the building, let's say those ones, and press this button over here, and then move those into the G2 group. So now I have G1 and G2, and let me remove the selection list, empty the selection list. And now what you can do with these is, for example, you can go to your G1, right click, and say select items. And when you do that, all the items which are added to the G1 group are then selected automatically. So it becomes a quick selection filter if you wish. Similarly, you could go to G2 and right click and say add to selection, and or you could say select items, in which case these ones will be unselected and the new ones will be selected. But if you say add to selection, then those items are then added to the existing selection. Now, another thing which you can do is you can add or remove items from existing groups. So let's say G2 consists of, if I were to go and say select items, G2 is this. But let's say I decide that, I've added this column unnecessarily and I don't want to include that column. So all you need to do is just select that column, go to G2 and say remove this ID from the group. Remove IDs from the group. And when you do that, then that particular ID is removed from the group. And now if I were to go to G2 and say select items, then that column is not selected. Similarly, I can add it back in. So I can just select that, go back to G2, right click and say add this ID to the group. And when I do that, this time if I do a selection based on the group, this column is once again in the list. Now let's get to the most important usage feature of these groups, and that we had said in the beginning was related to filtering. And so if I were to double click on the view and go to my filter command, we can see that in the filter command, we have the general, the object types, the profile, plate, solid, macros, rebars, analysis and design, UDA related. But we also have this tab over here called groups. And in the groups tab, we have all the groups that we have created on under the tree view, under the groups section. And we had just created G1 and G2 as well. And under G1, we had created a subgroup as well. But what you can do over here is, for example, you can select G1 and say, so this button over here basically converts it into a not. So what this would mean is everything but G1. And if I turned it, if I unflagged it, it would mean only G1. So let's use it with the not command and say OK and OK again. Now what happens is, if you notice, that area has been emptied. That randomly selected area has been emptied. And now, this is different from normally. I mean, you could have thought that I could just say right click and say show only stuff or show everything else. But those are temporary filters, which only with the moment you bring everything back on, they come back. But these are actually now permanent filter based. So they're inside the filter command now. So I could turn both G1 and G2 off, for example. And now both of them, that part of the floor and this part of the floor, have been removed from the filtering. And this is extremely useful, actually, much more so in your drawings, because on the drawing side, you occasionally, or in a lot of cases actually, when you're dealing with very complicated structures and you're dealing with very complicated structures within structures, so you're dealing with little platforms over here and you're dealing with pipe supports and all sorts of complex things, which don't really lend themselves to filtering, because if you filter out those profiles, then some other profiles also get filtered. If you try to filter them out by ID numbers, that's extremely time consuming. So this feature actually becomes extremely useful when you go towards it on the drawing side. In your drawing side, you can create these, once you're done with the model, you can create these filters, you can create these groups. And like I said, these groups are in the form of an hierarchy. They're like a directory structure. You can actually have groups within groups within groups. So you can have your entire building. You can have floor 1, floor 2, floor 3. You can have the access platforms of floor 1, the pipe supports for floor 1. You can basically make any logical grouping which you want, which you wouldn't be able to do by using merely the filters. And then what you could do is you could go to your drawing side and just very easily turn on and off these filters. Like, for example, a lot of times when you're looking at things from the plan view, you want certain things which are not entirely in the view to show and certain other ones not to show. And then that becomes a very difficult filter to implement, because you can either remove everything by using this partial filter to converting into a full. But if you wanted to show a particular one, then you would really need to work your way around that. But with this grouping option, you it becomes like it's like totally in your control. It becomes like an arbitrary filter. You can say, I want to show this and this and this and this, and that's what you can do by just putting all those things in a group. So this group filtering option is extremely powerful, and now we can quickly do an example of a drawing. So this floor level is at 118 meters from the zero level. So let's quickly create a GA drawing. Let's go to the drawing side and go to the drawing manager and create a new drawing. And so let's just call it GA1, and let's make it an A0 drawing. And let's save that empty drawing, and then let's go to our 118,000, wherever that is. I'll need to find that. There it is. Planet elevation 118,000. Let's just say create a viewport. Now it's importing the floor inside the drawing for us. And now, after removing some of the objects which were unnecessarily being imported, like solids, etc., we end up with this. And if you were wondering why these are all shown in hidden line format, it's because if you were to go back to the drawing side and turn it on, there are actually lots of there's a filter over here which I've turned on. That's the reason why you could. Let me go to the plate one, for example, and turn on my checkered plates. So in reality, we've got checkered plates all over this floor, and that's why anything which was behind the checkered plate is being shown in the drawings like that. So let me go back to the drawing side and apply the same filter. Let me double click on this one, go to the filtering section, go to the filter one, go to my plate one, and say I don't want to see the checkered plates, and turn them off. And when I do that, I get a normal view. I still have the stiffness behind the checkered plates, which I can also turn off. But the idea which we were talking about is actually groups. Now, if you remember, we'd created two groups called G1 and G2, somewhere over here and somewhere over here. Now, if I were to double click on this one and go to the filtering section and go to my filter settings, and this time I go to the groups tab over here, I have the very same G1 and G2 which I had created on the model side, also on my drawing side. So if I were to say I don't want to see G1 and say OK and import that back into again, you see that area has been removed from the drawing. And similarly, if I were to go in again and go to the filtering, select that, press G2 and include that as well with a not that I don't want to include those, then this random selection basically has been implemented. Now, this is a very powerful feature which you will need especially when you're dealing with very complicated structures, in which it's basically you want to choose arbitrarily what you want to show and what you don't want to show. You can reverse this filter as well. Let's go to the filtering option again and say, instead of not, as you can say, I only want to see G1 and G2. And when you do that, then you basically get only that part of the floor. Now, you would not be able to do this by using filters like this profile size or that profile size, because this is a totally arbitrary selection. And this really makes your work a lot easier for you when you're dealing with very complicated structures. Now, I, for one, love looking at models created by other people and how they have gone about creating the drawings and using the different features of Comosys. And one thing I've noted is that on the drawing side, they are using this grouping idea a lot. And because one reason for that is that because we are dealing with structures with a lot of complicated intermediate floors, access platforms, ladders, this and that, and stuff which needs to be hidden sometimes, stuff which needs to be shown sometimes, and they don't really lend themselves to classical filtering techniques. So whenever I look at models and whenever I go to the drawing sides, whenever there's a complex structure involved, I see an extensive use of groups. And this is a feature which is quite unique to Comosys. And I'm not very sure, but I think it's difficult to find this kind of feature in other programs. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because this is a real need as far as the sector is concerned, as far as the drafting and the drawing side is concerned, and even for the modeling side. Because what it allows you is to arbitrarily choose what you want to show and what you don't want to show. And that really helps creating cleaner and better drawings.